Hey folks, and thanks for joining me. If you're just joining for the first time, we've painted this Tiger 1 by RFM with full interior over the last couple of weeks. And last week, we actually got to fully assemble the exterior and get this thing ready for some paint. So why don't we do that? So the first thing we need to address is the comments from last week, and I wanted to say thank you for all those that did put a comment in the comment section on the video last week. So we do have to address one thing after we tear this tank down. We need to put back what I took off previously by mistake. So there were actually some lifting points on this top plate of the turret. So what I did was I took some styrene rod, because I didn't have any tube the right size, and I just drilled out the hole and trimmed it. Cut a few of these till I got some nice round looking ones, and then I just put them into place using styrene cement, and this was a pretty easy fix. So again, I wanted to say thank you to those who spoke up in the comments to point out my mistake I had made. I didn't see this on any reference drawings or images, so it was tough for me to see that. So next step is to mask off the inside, because you can spray through that open grating for the radiator vents, so we don't want to spray the inside with all the paint we're about to apply. So mask that off. Then we're going to put this on my paint stand, and if you're interested in this paint stand you have a 3D printer, you can use my promo code over at cults3d.com to get this designed for yourself. So first thing we got to do is prep all of our metal parts. Anybody who's seen me paint tanks before, you know that I always prime all my metal parts first, and that helps with the paint adhesion. Now the trick here is you want to make sure you only do the flat metal parts, don't do this grating. But one thing I did realize at this point I forgot to do during the build process was actually to take my paintbrush here and push down on those parts of the vents on top where the crew would have walked on them and whatnot. So we also want to get this metal cable that I made, and again all these little tool clasps and parts, anything that's brass we just want to get if we can. Outside of the vents, we don't want to do anything where there's like little holes in, because then it could bridge the gap and then it won't look realistic. So any of these big flat metal parts specifically, we got to make sure we get those. You can probably get away without doing this on the metal tool clasps, but I would recommend it if you can. Same thing with this box on the back of the turret and the little locks that we have on there. Got to make sure all of our metal parts are ready. And last but not least, our barrel. We have this aluminum turn barrel on this tank. Got to make sure we get that. So this time I'm going to do something different. I'm going to use Mr. Mahogany Surfacer. So we're going to use brown. And the reason I'm choosing brown is because we're going to be painting this with a Dunkelgelb base color, which is like a yellow. And we're also going to be priming this. So we just want a warm undertone. That, and I wanted to use some lacquer primer this time instead of Vallejos primer, just to change it up a little bit. So just priming this brown over everything on this tank. Nice thin coats, even coats. We don't want to cover up any details, but we want to make sure we get good adhesion. And the key here too is to make sure that your metal prep stuff is completely dry before you go to this step. So we can see these nice results at the end. It looks really good. Also want to do our wheels. So just again light coats, going over our wheels, taking our time, making them look nice. These don't have to be perfect because there's going to be plenty more paint going on them, but again, we just want a nice bit for adhesion. So the next step we're going to do is actually put some primer colors on here. So we're going to start with Rut Brown on the outside of this tank. Now, what I want to do here is I want to try chipping fluid. So we're going to try something a little bit different. Usually I do just chipping with a sponge afterwards, but I wanted to try chipping fluid. And I figured this is a perfect candidate because there's two different colors for chipping. So we have the Rut Brown primer, and we also have the Zimmer, because the primer was underneath the Zimmer, so the Zimmer had a different color. So rather than having to chip two different colors, why not just paint them on and chip them with chipping fluid? At least that's my thought process. So after we get the initial coat of Rut Brown down on everything, we're actually going to do something else that's a little different. I want to color modulate my primer coat. Now, is that something that anyone's ever heard of before? Because I don't know if I've ever seen it. I'm sure it's been done. I'm sure I'm not that inventive. But the point is, I want to try something a little bit different. So we're going to put some red-brown shadow in the recessed parts on this primer coat. And again, we're just trying to add a little bit of color modulation. So what that means is we're trying to add different color gradients of the same color. So red brown is the base, the red brown. That's just German for red brown. We're going to put that in the shadowed areas, and then we're going to come back with a light red brown, and we're going to do all the highlights. So here's our red brown light. We'll do all the highlights. So all the raised surfaces such as these hatches, anything that's just standing up off the hull. It's just giving us a nice color gradient for the primer coat. Now, what is this going to do later? Well, when we go to do our chipping with the chipping fluid underneath our Dunkelgelb and our three-tone camouflage, we will actually see subtle color variance in different areas of the tank that we choose to chip. What does that do for the viewer? Well, it gives them something for their eye to see. Makes it a little bit more eye-catching to see brighter colors, darker colors, a nice gradient. So at this point, we're going to come back with our Zimmer Color, and we're going to go over all the Zimmer. So I masked off the parts that I wanted to make sure stayed red and went over it with the Zimmer Color. Just again adding that contrast, well, and adding a realistic contrast, because again, this is how it would really look before it was painted with Dunkelgelb. You'd have the red primer and you'd have the Zimmer natural color. So this is the color that ammo offers that's supposed to match Zimmer color. I know there's some debate over what it actually looked like color wise, but I think this looks pretty good. And you can see we have definite contrast there. Same thing on the turret. And this is again why I said I wanted to do chipping fluid, because now we have this contrast between the grayish, light yellow, almost white color of the Zimmer, and then we have the different gradients within the red primer. So we have some nice gradients. I actually think this looks really cool, and it kind of makes me want to do a just out of the factory build before it's even painted, because I thought it looked really cool when it was done there. So here's the chipping fluid that I mentioned we're going to do. So I'm using the scratches effect just because I wanted a more subtle effect. More in scale chipping, so that's why I didn't use the heavy chipping fluid. And what I did was I applied 2 coats generously over the surface, and this stuff is great because it dries flat. Even though it looks like it goes on really thick and lumpy, it actually dries perfectly smooth. And after 2 coats of this, then you can start your painting. So again, we're just doing the entire area that we will eventually chip, and then we'll move on to our Dunkelgelb base. So I was jokingly calling this the mustard coat when we were on the Hobby Time Modeler stream the other day, because when I got done with it, it felt like I was putting mustard on ketchup, because I had a red tank and I was putting yellow on it. But it looked really nice. It kept it nice and warm, so the primer coats of the brown and the red kept everything very warm, and that's probably why it felt more like mustard. But I did enjoy this process. It was very enjoyable, and again, we're seeing how we're covering up the Zimmer coat, we're covering up the primer coat with this Dunkelgelb. We're just giving it a nice top coat, thin layers. We're not, throwing this on with a big needle. I'm actually only using a 0.2 needle in my cup to apply this, just as an FYI, and I have it slightly thinned for spraying. So again, we're just putting light passes, light coats, not flooding the surface with this paint, just trying to make sure that we get good coverage, because this is our base coat of paint. So we want to make sure we get all the nooks and crannies and cover that. Then we're going to move the Dunkelgelb dark base. So this is what we're going to do, very similar to what we did with the color modulation on the primer color. We're going to do the same thing with the Dunkelgelb. We're going to go through in all the recessed areas and just give us a little bit of a darker tone. And again, what is this going to do for the observer? This is going to make it so their eye sees multiple colors. We're going to recess here, paint these recesses here on the fenders, same thing on top of the turret. And it's just meant to be, again, color modulation, which is giving you the same color but a gradient for your eyes to see. And it makes it look more realistic too, because if you ever look at any vehicle outside in the daylight, it never is just one shade of that color. So the other thing I'm trying to show here is I actually brought color modulation onto the wheels as well. So the innermost road wheels I did in Dunkelgelb dark base, the middle wheels I did in base color, and the outer wheels I did in light base color. So Speaking of light base, we're going to do this to highlight a few areas on top. So I'll speed this up for you guys. You can see all the areas I'm choosing to highlight. Anything that's just kind of standing out, or maybe I should say sticking out, or something that maybe you want to highlight and stand out from the hull of the tank. So basically, again, color modulation, you're trying to bring out details that you otherwise wouldn't see if everything was one tone of paint. That's another benefit to color modulation. I mean, just take a look at how much it's standing out now, with all those hatches and little bits and bobs that are sticking up. The other thing I want to do is create a gradient right on the edge of those fenders, because depending on how the light would catch it, you'd get this gradient. You'd be dark closest to the tank and lighter on the outside parts away from the tank, just because that's how the sunlight would kind of catch it, and the tank itself would cast a shadow on those fenders. So that's why I did a little bit of a color gradient on those fenders. Coming back up to the top of the turret, we're doing our highlights on everything that's standing up, just like we did before. And if you notice, we did the dark base towards the bottom of the turret, we did the highlights on all the little bits and bobs, especially on the top of the turret, and we get this really nice gradient. We get this really nice, popping of the details. I also want to add a gradient on this panel here, just a little bit, to separate the front of the tank, the front of the turret to the back of the turret. So here's showing again how I color modulated the outermost wheel. So now we have our base coat down, we want to switch to olive green. So this is a nice dark green color, kind of a faded green color, and I thinned it down with acrylic thinner and some paint retarder from VMS. This is really critical, because what you're doing is you're applying a freehand camouflage, which is historically accurate because these were typically applied in the field with a guy with a spray brush. So not much different than what we're doing here, but the difference is we're doing it in 1/35th scale. So your paint has to be very, very thin. And one of the things with these acrylics by Ammo, or any acrylic, really, you're going to struggle with paint drying on your tip. It's just called tip drying. And that's why the airbrush retarder is so important to have in your mix. So make sure you have some kind of airbrush retarder that you can mix in with your paint, and it's going to be a humongous help, and it'll make it a lot less frustrating when you go to do something like this. Because what'll happen if you go to get a clog is eventually that clog will break and you'll burst paint all over your model, and you'll be so frustrated. So just save yourself the headache. Make sure you have airbrush retarder before you start painting this. Or the other option is to choose a lacquer paint that you can also thin down, but I would still recommend you use some type of a thinner with retarder, even if you're using lacquer paints, just because you need your paint very thin. So one thing to note too is that I actually changed my needle out on this airbrush. I have a Harder and Steenbeck airbrush here that I'm using, and I switched it out to a 0.15 millimeter nozzle and needle to do this. So I did use a smaller needle than a 0.2 because I wanted that precision to be able to create this historically accurate camouflage. Now the other tip I'll give you for doing freehand camo is don't rely on your memory or a vision in your head to do this. Make sure you have a reference photo. So what you can't see in the footage here is that my phone is right next to my paint stand with a picture from each angle of a tiger tank that I'm trying to recreate. So make sure that you have some type of reference photo so you don't just let your mind go wild. I'm not saying you can't be creative, but what you'll find is we're actually not as creative as the real thing, which is kind of interesting. So definitely have some kind of a reference photo and take your time when you do this and try to make it as accurate as possible while still having a little bit of room for creativity, of course. One other note I'll make is that if you are using a reference photo, don't stare at your reference photo and stop moving your hand with your airbrush. I had that happen one time and almost made an oopsie with flooding one specific spot with paint because I left my finger on the trigger while I was staring at my reference photo. So definitely learn from my mistake and don't do that. One other thing here is we do have the exhaust shrouds to paint. So what I did was, using the reference photo, I painted the back of the tank first, and then I went over and matched up as best I could on the shrouds as well. So moving on to the top of the turret, what I tried doing here after doing this for a couple hours was outlining a patch first and then filling it in. If you can do this, it's a great way to do it. Sometimes the camouflage patterns aren't necessarily big enough You know, maybe they're just lines or whatnot that you don't necessarily have to outline them. So again, this is very tricky. If you haven't done a freehand one before, I definitely recommend trying it, but I would also recommend trying it on maybe a test subject or some other old model or something first, or even a piece of paper is fine, just so you kind of get the feel down of your airbrush, you know, especially if it's a new airbrush or you're not used to it, or again, haven't done a freehand before. You're going to want to try out on a test subject first, just so you know, get any mistakes out on something where it doesn't count. Because the last thing you want to have to do is, again, get frustrated and have to cover it up. So what's cool is, if you take notice, as we're doing this camouflage, you can still see all the color modulation for the Dunkelgelb, but it's working really well as the green actually starts to tone it down. So after we got the green parts down, I switched over to brown. And I did have a little bit of trouble with brown. It did not want to flow as well, even though I used the same concoction as I did on the green with the thinner and paint retarder. I eventually did get it to flow a little bit better as it was going, as I was moving along. It started to get a little bit better, but I definitely did struggle more with the brown than I did with the green. As you can see here, I was definitely having some struggle, but all in all, I was very happy with how this went down. I think it just had to do with the mix of the brown I was using. I just think brown is a thicker paint, and I probably should have thinned it more, so I think that was where my issue was. Whereas green paints tend to be a little bit thinner and a little bit easier to spray. At least that's my experience so far. So again, I'm using a reference photo this entire time for both the green and the brown. One thing I did note is that I probably actually should have painted the brown first, which might seem silly because it's darker. So either way, there's not necessarily a right way to do it, but you can paint green or brown first. I just noticed in my reference photos that it's pretty clear that the brown was painted first and then the green over top of it. So I think the results speak for themselves. I did the same thing on the turd as you guys saw. So I think these results just turned out really, really well. So now that we have our three-tone camouflage down, we have a few more things we need to paint. So we're going to paint the gray on all of our steel parts, and this is just, I believe it's Schwarzgrau is the color I used from Ammo to paint all the steel tools and parts here. So we're just brush painting all of this stuff. This is just straight out the bottle. Ammo stuff is nice like that in most paint colors, I should say, that you can take it straight out the bottle. There are a few that are a little difficult to brush because they're too thin, but this gray is a really nice color that I like using for painting all the steel tools and clasps. Well, in this case, I should say, we have our cable here we have to paint as well. So just anything we have to paint gray, it's a nice generic gray color. Now, you'll notice that I'm going into a lot more detail in this video, and the reason I'm doing that is because I want to focus on trying to share my thought process a little bit more, and I want to focus in on certain areas. So specifically today, we're just going to be doing the painting. So you can see we're really going into detail. Here we have our spare tracks on top of the turret. We're going to paint steel as well, and we're just prepping this tank for the enamel washes, pin washes, and chipping that we're going to do next time. So as you've already seen, the chipping fluid's down and we're ready to go. But we're going to do that in the next video. So I hope you guys will join me for that when we do get to that point. So definitely a lot more to go on this Tiger. We're nowhere near done. So now that we got all the steel parts painted, we're going to come back and paint the wood. So I like to use light wood. You can use old wood, new wood. It doesn't matter what you do. We're only going to paint this light wood for now, but as I said, we're going to do enamel washes next. That's where we're going to bring out the steel texture, the steel look with some rust tones. We're going to bring out the wood texture with some brown wash. We'll do that in the next video. But I just wanted to show you the details that we go through. This light wood from Ammo is a really good one because Ammo's paints are a little bit thinner, so it makes them nice for airbrush and brushing, and it goes really well down on these tools. So I did use my hobby blade and just put a few little scratches inside of these tools, and the idea is not so much to make a wood texture, it's more so to make little lines for the wash to seep into in the next video, similar to what that block, the jack block, looks like there. As you see on your screen, you can see that one's molded on already from the kit. I just wanted to add a little bit of my own to these other ones, so that way it wasn't just one piece of wood with some wood texture. I wanted all the wood to have a little bit of something, and again, it'll really come out when we add that brown wash in the next video. So I mixed some rough brown with a little bit of light red brown to make that red color for the tool there that we just painted. So the last thing, I believe, next to last thing to paint, I took some field gray and we painted this tarp that we sculpted in the last video. I'm so happy with the way this turned out. I felt like this tarp turned out a lot better than the one on my T34. It got much thinner, so I'm happy that I'm seeing an improvement in my sculpting abilities with some green stuff. So I also, after I did the field gray, I added some gray, like dark gray, into the field gray color to add like a shadow underneath these folds here, just to add a little bit more visual texture. And then I'm going to come back, I added some Dunkelgelb, some light Dunkelgelb into the same field gray to make like a highlight. Again, just trying to keep the same tone as the field gray is kind of a greenish gray, so trying to keep the same tones for the different highlight coats. Now at this point I wanted to take the color modulation a little bit further, because you can spray so much, but you want to actually take your brush and hit some of these details, like those little locks on the back of the stowage box on the turret, these big honking bolts that hold that 88 in place, and any other little details, like look at this little bolt on the end there of the gun. Now we also have all these little bolts on the engine deck, so I just highlighted these with different shades of highlight color. I did mix in a little bit of brown and green with the Dunkelgelb highlight color just to give a little bit of contrast, so they weren't all exactly the same color. And again, we're just bringing out all these little tiny details, because when we put a pin wash on them, they're going to get darker and we don't want to hide them. Same thing with these tool clasps. Now I know it looks like the tool clasps are going to blend in right now with the wood, but remember, we're going to wash the wood in the next video, so that'll look really nice. So at this point, we can finally take off that masking that we put on the inside of the tank. And I actually did add some extra masking, and you can see some still got through, some paint got through the radiators. So this fits like a glove now that we got everything painted and put together. I'm just so happy with how well this fit is from RFM, with very little modification, a little bit of sanding here or there to make it fit from me, but that was it. Out of the box, this thing fits like a glove. So you can see how just highlighting a few details here and there, it really makes them pop off the tank. So one last step, we need to take care of our MG that sits on top. So I did paint it black, and then took this gunmetal dry brush and painted it on. Now we have a completed tank, at least on the exterior. The base coat's done. We have a lot more work to do. I also wanted to show that I color modulated some wheels here. You can see the 3 different shades that I used. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoy this reveal. Alright folks, as I mentioned, we are going to be chipping and weathering this tank in the next video. So I hope you guys will join me for that. If you don't want to miss out on that, please hit that subscribe button. If you like what you saw today, please like and leave me a comment. I'm willing to read every single comment that you guys leave. I do, and I really appreciate them. If you want to see more timely updates almost on a daily basis, if you want to get in contact with me through direct messages, you want to just talk about anything, why don't you check out my Patreon? I'd really appreciate the support, and I'd love to talk with each and every one of you on different ideas for models. Maybe you want some feedback on yours. I'd be happy to do that. So please check out my Patreon, and thank you guys. We'll see you next time.